We're 10 years old, and we are officially, at least in some ways, no longer a startup. So now what do we do? Now it's time to think about strategy. It's time to think about vision. And if we have laid for ourselves a reliable foundation, we can start thinking outside of maybe what our early expectations were about how big we would be and who our constituencies would be and how many Lutheran or not Lutheran families we would have. And because we're by this time, we're starting to kind of see how the market is delivering to us the people who are going to be part of our school.
Yeah, just carry on.
All right, so it'll just be scratchy, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I have observed about parochial schools especially, I think, is that we have a tendency to sort of think about as big as the container that we think we have to fill. So if we have a building that holds 250 kids, we think, well, we're going to be a 250 student school. And if we have a small gym maybe that we share with other ministries in the church, we have a tendency to think, well, it's not really a competition gym, so we're probably not going to be an athletic school, and we sort of condition ourselves to limitations, and I like to see parochial schools that start to think outside of those natural boundaries, outside of the natural boxes. I have a good friend and a client in East Texas, and his school was started by a church, still remains a ministry of the church, but over the last 20 years, the school has actually expanded beyond the facilities of the church and built a whole new campus with an athletic complex and has grown to be a school of about 1,000 students. And they're still thinking about growing. So now the church uses the facilities that were initiated by the school as part of its growth plan, and the church supported the school in that plan, even though it couldn't financially support all of that. The school becomes less and less dependent on the church for resources and for facilities, but they still have a harmonious and a harmonious relationship, and the school understands itself still to be under the authority of the church and the church leadership. So there are things that we can do that sometimes we have to give ourselves time to imagine. And so what I'd like to talk about in this session is sort of what does the process look like for a school at about 10 years or so to start thinking about its future and start, like I say here, expanding our expectations for who we might be and what might be possible, and how do you and what has to happen, and what do we need to do in order to make that happen. So here's some planning principles. A lot of what we do as a consulting group has to do with helping schools to develop plans for their future. And when we begin the process, I'm very careful and I'm very insistent that we not what I sometimes call self-edit. So before we even throw an idea out, in the back of our brain, something tells us, but we're never ever going to be able to do that, or that's going to be too expensive, or the church won't go for that, and so we don't say it. And then we lose the opportunity to dream a little bit and to imagine what might be possible, even if in the end it becomes not really possible. All right. So rather than jumping to the end and saying, well, that'll never happen, we start at the beginning and say, well, what if? I mean, what if? Forget about. I mean, the other thing I say to schools sometimes is the only reason $1 million sounds like a lot of money is because you don't have $1 million. And the only reason that it sounds like it would be hard to raise $1 million is because you've never raised $1 million. But schools do it all the time. So if we put that condition on ourselves that says, well, $1 million is too much for our little tiny little school, then we're not going to get $1 million. It's not going to just drop out of the sky, probably, right? I mean, it might, but don't bet on it, right? Don't. What do we call that? Presuming on God's providence or something like that. So first thing we do is we suspend limitational thinking. And we allow ourselves to think, well, how many students in this community could benefit from a classical Lutheran education? What's the answer? All of them. All of them. So, why should we constrain ourselves to 240 kids? Just because that happens to be the size of the building that we have, or that's the amount of parking that the city is allowing us to use, or whatever those constraints happen to be. The other thing I encourage schools to do is think about expansion developmentally. So this could go all the way back to the earlier years, or it could be we're at a point, say, in 10 years where we've got a good, solid pre-K 5, and we're thinking about middle school or something like that. So think the challenge here is to think about expanding the program or growing the program rather than a year at a time, but in stages of programming that correspond to the development of kids. Because remember, what we're trying to do is be intentional about the kids' experience. We're not just lining up courses for them to take and books for them to read and content for them to master. We're also thinking about the environment in which all of that has to happen, and whether it's good for them or whether it's better for us, the adults. So thinking about, well, what would a middle school, a logic school environment consist of? The whole thing, not just the first year and then the second year and the third year. So we start crafting a vision for the kids and their experience and the cultural impact of being a middle schooler, a middle years student in our school. So we think more in chunks rather than just a year at a time. We've worked with classical schools, about half a dozen classical schools over the last 13 years to help them develop high school programs. So they get up to 8th grade, and then there's that big leap just sort of imaginatively to high school. We know it's harder. We know it's more expensive. We know it counts. If you screw it up, there are problems with all sorts of problems with parents and kids and colleges and all of that. And we always if they're going to hire us to help them do it, we will only do a 4-year plan. We won't do a 1-year plan, 2-year plan, 3-year plan. We'll do a 4-year plan. And there are several reasons for that. Number one, it gives parents and kids a vision for what the whole thing, that whole experience is going to look like and how it's going to grow around them. So those first 14 kids who were freshmen of the only high school, we have a high school now with 14 kids. But then there's going to be another 14 behind them, and then there's going to be maybe 20 behind them, and then there's maybe going to be 28 or 30 behind them. So that by the time they graduate, or by the time they're seniors, it's a high school of 100 kids. That's a whole different vision than just saying, well, I'm just going to be in 9th grade, and there'll be 14 of us. Well, that sounds like fun, right? So they get an opportunity to pioneer, and people are going to fill in behind them. The other thing it does is it makes us as a school community accountable for that goal. So once we've said this is a 4-year plan, and we are going to go from 9th grade to 12th grade, and in 4 years, kids are going to graduate from this school, it's less likely that when things get hard in year 2, that we retreat and pull back and say, this is too hard. We're going to pull the plug. Because people have come in with that expectation, and now we have this obligation to them to finish the plan, because that's really what they're signing up for. Nobody signs up for 1 year of high school, right? Nobody signs up for 2 years or 3 years of high school. It's a 4-year deal. So thinking and packaging our planning in developmentally is really important. And then designing in detail, meaning it's not just the goal, not just that we want to have a high school, not just that we're going to have 4 grades developed over 4 years. Who's going to do it? And how are they going to do it? And how is it going to get paid for? And what other support structures will be in place? And how are we going to calculate the costs as they change as the program goes? So we need to have as many of the questions answered as possible as we go forward into the future, even on things that are a little less dynamic than starting a high school. Let's say that we want to set a goal of increasing our fundraising from $100,000 a year to $200,000 a year. Okay, great. Now what? We just write $200,000 in the budget and do what we've been doing, for the $100,000? No, we've got to have a plan. We have to have an assignment. We have to have time frames. We have to have all of the things that are necessary so that there is accountability and so that we are as much as possible ensuring the likelihood of the success of the initiative. So when you draw up a strategic plan, even if it's not a very complicated strategic plan, every goal is going to have 4 or 5 other components attached to it that describe how this is going to happen and who's going to be responsible and what time frames and what's it going to cost and what do we expect the result to be. How will we know that we achieved that goal? Which makes planning a little bit tedious if you do it right. But it's much more beneficial than if we just say, well, let's just set a goal and we'll all just sort of meander toward the goal and hope it happens. So we're designing in detail. And then always, we are determining the cost up front for everything that we're going to do. We should only ever be surprised if a thing ends up being less expensive than we thought it was going to be, not more. That's called counting the cost. It's a biblical principle. I like the story of the parable that Jesus told about the people who started to build a tower and then ran out of money and then left the tower there half built. And in the passage it says that the people were ridiculed for not completing the tower. And I think it's interesting that Jesus told that story and there was not a moral point to it. The moral the consequence of not building the tower or half building the tower is a social consequence, not a moral consequence. Jesus didn't say it was a sin that they didn't plan well and so couldn't get the tower built. He just said they were silly. And I think the implication is if we're going to have a school that has Christian and Lutheran and essentially Jesus in the name, let's not be silly. Let's not let people tell us that we're silly because we do silly things like not count the cost for things. So that strategy, that's a very, very shorthand type framework for the kind of thinking we start to do in 10 years. Now let's talk about process. So those are the principles. Let's talk about process. Whatever that entity is, I'm just going to call it the board. Whatever that entity is that has the primary responsibility for mission preservation and for the fiduciary health of the school, we need to ask our question about 10 years, how is that group spending its time? What are they thinking about? Because it's natural that in the first few years of a school, even if it's well-funded and even if you don't require volunteer labor and all of that, you're still going to have people sort of in the thing and helping out because there's so many things to do. There's a policy manual to write. There's a there's a org chart somebody needs to draw. There's someone has to work on the strategic plan and put it into documents. There's just a lot of stuff to do. And so we have a tendency in those first few years to use our volunteer leaders, our governors, our board members, whoever they are in your context, to help out with all that stuff. And that's what we end up talking about. So we meet maybe monthly or maybe more frequently than that. I consulted with a school a few years ago that was about, I don't know, 7 years old or so. And their board was meeting twice a month for at least 4 hours every time. It was awful. It was just awful. So I tried to help them to stop that, right? But it was a function of the fact that they were all involved in all this stuff. And so they always had stuff to talk about and decisions to make together and all of that. So at the 10-year mark, I want the board to start moving its training its focus on the future, and to start calibrating how much time we spend talking about things at the board meeting that are present or past versus what's future, and start moving ourselves from the 80% present and past that we've been accustomed to talking about to more like 60, 70, 80% future, and leaving the present and the past more to the leadership team that we've got.
Stop micromanaging like you had to do in the first few years.
Yeah.
Or you thought you did.
Right. And frankly, I mean, if we don't have a firm enough, financial plan or a firm enough organizational base that we can do that, that requires some serious consideration, because 10 years old, we ought to be somewhat stable. We ought to kind of know how this thing is running, and we should have patterns, and we should have, sort of predictable expectations for those things, right? And when I talk about present and past, I mean, number one, the past, you know how the board meetings go, maybe. We're adjudicating or we're discussing something that happened 3 weeks ago that we happened to hear about. So there were sixth graders got in a fight during recess, and we want to talk about the fight and what we did about it and how we're going to prevent that in the future. And do we have a bullying problem anyway, people here? All right. Nothing that a board can do about that. All they can do is just, get excited. But it's interesting. I mean, bullying is interesting to talk about. It's way more interesting than strategic planning. I mean, got to be honest. Or the present. We're hiring people. We're trying to get people on board. We're trying to, or we're working on admissions. What are the numbers? And we need better marketing. We need to, the sort of solving those problems in the present, rather than thinking more about where do we want to be this time next year. Let's set ourselves some goals. If we need better marketing, we need better marketing, but let's make ourselves accountable to some goals.
Two things. Starting something can draw the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
It's the thrill, the adrenaline rush out of starting something new.
Yeah, that's me, by the way.
So, but is there the expectation that a person can be on the board for a 10-year period of time, or what kind of rotation are we talking about this 10 years?
We're going to get to that in just a second. In my experience, what tends to happen is that people who are really invested tend to stay through the startup period because they want to see it to some sort of completion. But then you have to decide, now what do we do? How do we bring some balance back to this whole thing? Because the startup mode is not sustainable, And those of us who are sort of entrepreneurial and initiators, we get bored with stuff anyway. So after 4 or 5 years of something, I'm like, I'm out. I'm going to go do something else.
In my experience in high-tech startups, the entrepreneur, he was good for the first couple, 3 years if we survived that long, and then he's bored.
Yeah.
And then you got to get real managers in. He doesn't care about that. He's not even good at it.
Right.
And
it doesn't make him happy. It does not bring any joy to show up to manage something to someone who's like that.
Startup boards might have individuals who thrive on the beginning, like the entrepreneur.
Yeah, they almost always do. They almost always do, because it takes so much energy to to be a catalyst for something that's brand new. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of focus, a lot of enthusiasm, and so there is a handoff point that we're going to talk about. At this point, you're going to want to have be in the process of developing a 5-year plan for your school. And I generally recommend 6 areas of operation in which goals are starting to be set on a sort of a 5-year framework. So we're gonna talk about mission and vision. Who are we? Who are we for? We're going to talk about student programming. We're going to talk about enrollment goals. We're going to set goals for ourselves in leadership and staffing and governance. And we're going to set goals for ourselves in facilities and in finance. Is that 6? Did anybody write those down? So, yeah, I'll say them again, and then we can count them. So, mission and vision, student programming, enrollment, leadership and staffing, facilities, and then finance. And the finance is done last because the plan needs to be developed in a way that I can build a business model for the plan, so that we don't end up in a situation where we say, well, in 3 years we want to hire a full-time admissions director, and in 3 years we don't have enough money in the budget to hire a full-time admissions director because we forgot to think 3 years ahead, right? And then every year we meet again. Doesn't take as long, but we spend a day together, board, executive staff, headmaster, and maybe principals or somebody else who's got administrative responsibility, and we kick it all out a year. We evaluate what we were able to accomplish in that year. We look at what we have on the plate for this next year, and then we push the whole thing out another year with maybe more initiatives, or maybe elongating the time frame, giving ourselves a little bit more runway for the things that are already in the plan, so that every year, if we're asked if we have a strategic plan, we can say yes, we have a 5-year plan. So we don't do this. We don't do a 5-year plan, which is what most schools do, which is how I stay in business, by the way. So don't tell them what I'm telling you. But we don't do a 5-year plan and then go for 5 years with no planning, get to the end and go, whew, glad that's over. Let's do another 5-year plan, right? So we're building this thing incrementally, year by year, but with a 5-year outlook. Our planning process at 10 years becomes much more collaborative and community oriented. So in those early years, with the 10 or 20 or 30 families that we had, we were talking all the time. And because we were like a big family, but like a bunch of cousins. And so we kind of knew what everybody was thinking, and everybody had their opportunity to have their say. But now that we're at 50 families or 70 families or maybe 100 families, not everybody has the same opportunity, and not everybody was here when we started this thing either. So they don't have the same organizational memory of how it all started and all the things that we did together. And we went up to the school on Friday night, and parents vacuumed the classrooms and emptied the waste baskets and put up all the desks so that they could have Sunday school. And then we came back up on Sunday night and we put all the desks back out and that kind of stuff, right? So now we have to be more intentionally communal, and we have to listen to the periphery, because they matter. They're not as vocal. They're not on the inside. They're not in the founders club. But what they think about where we should be going in the future matters a lot. And so we have to find ways to bring them into the process. And then finally on this, our strategy, rather than just a bunch of stuff to do, really becomes our investment plan. Where are we going to put our energy? Where are we going to spend money? Where are we going to commit resources over the next few years, 5 years? And what do we expect as the return on that investment? How will we know that we spent those resources well? That's essentially what our strategic plan is becoming. So before, when we were in the startup mode, it was we just need to get to here, and then we need to get to here, and then we need to get to here. Now we're organizing our resources, and we're organizing access to those resources so that we're accomplishing things that we understand are going to feed back into the school and are going to make it stronger. And we're starting to work toward that. In Good to Great, he calls the flywheel effect. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to generate momentum through strategic investment. It's really hard to do in the first 5 years of a school, but once we get into that decade environment, it begins to become necessary for us to do. And then we start talking about sustainability, but we're talking about sustainability from a standpoint of policy and principle, not just fiscal decisions. So previously, what we were doing is we were looking at our budget and we're going, how do we make this budget work? And we probably were dealing in maybe 2, maybe 3 year increments, but mostly in 1 year increments because every year matters so much. And we've got to figure out, we're just trying to put, all the pieces in the right place and not go down the tubes, not end up in a position where we're closing the doors. Now we're moving into the position where we are assigning to ourselves principles and policies that are going to guide financial decisions into the future. So we are saying things, we are imposing on ourselves policies like we may not raise in any given year more than 10% of the operating budget from donations. Policy means we've got to go someplace else for that revenue. We're also at a point where we can more realistically assess which revenue streams for our school and our circumstances are going to be more or less reliable. And so we can say, well, we need to raise $100,000 more than we raised last year, but we've got enough of a track record to understand that, number one, we might not have the capacity for that in our community, or even more importantly, people might not be willing to give to that. They'll give to other stuff that's cool, but they're not going to give to just keep the lights on and pay the bills. And now we're starting to figure out we were able to start to assess the reliability of some of those streams of revenue. I thought it was interesting when Steve Keyser said earlier that their school is tuition free. He told me afterwards that they're coming to a point where the school is presenting a strategic plan to the congregation, which is significantly more expensive than the school has been previously. And now the congregation is having to step back and go, can we really do this? Not do we want to, but can we sustain this level of investment in a school for the future? So that's exactly where they are. They're more than a 10-year-old school, but in terms of developmentally, they're sort of in this 10-year stage where they're having to ask themselves some hard questions. Maybe we need a fee structure that helps to subsidize a little bit more, or maybe we do need to introduce tuition at a subsidized level, or whatever they end up coming up with. So this is where we end up in that 10-year plan. We also need to be able to assess the full cost of programming. By now we know who we need. By now we know, look, we need a nurse, right? Somebody's got to take care of this pharmacy that these kids bring to school with them all the time. I've always thought it was hilarious. We'd go on a field trip. You'd send the middle schoolers on a field trip, and somebody's got the pharmacy bag because everybody's got to take their ADD medicine. Do not let the 12-year-olds miss their ADD medicine. So I'm carting it out to the bus and getting on the bus and going on the trip. So we need this. We need security. All right. We need whatever it is. We need aides in the grammar school. We need paid food service people. We need a janitor, a custodian who actually, gets paid. Those types of things. Now we know what we need. And so we start building the full cost of the operation, probably more realistically, into our models. And we're starting to think about how many kids do we actually need in order to do the things that parents and kids are starting to ask us to do. Parents and kids, we want a basketball program. Because now they're 11 and 12, and 11 and 12-year-olds want to play basketball. Or we need an orchestra. How many kids do we need in order to expand our programming, give kids more options, electives in middle school, or pullouts for kids with, mild dyslexia, or, all of this. How many students do we need in order for that to just all to make sense? What are those critical mass numbers? And we're starting to think about the big stuff. What would it cost for us to build a gym? What would it cost for us to put in a soccer field? What would it cost for us to add on to the existing building so that we get 4 more classrooms for the pre-K? Because we've got a lot of interest in the pre-K. So growth starts to cost money at this point. Growth starts to, and it starts to cost real money. But now we're in a position where we understand ourselves well enough. We understand sort of the basis from which we're operating well enough where it starts to make sense to have like a 7-figure conversation about something. Whereas 3 or 4 years earlier, it would have made no sense at all because, we're just trying to build it. Right? But now we're at a point where it's like, how much would it really cost to build a gym? And how big does a gym need to be? And should it have locker rooms? And what about a concession stand? And should it be connected to the other buildings so that, in the winter in Chicago, kids can go back and forth and they don't need to wear coats? And we're starting to have those types of conversations, right? And then the transitions. Oh, did I say hangover? Sorry, I meant handover. So this is the point at which some dangling ends we need to start figuring out what we're going to do with the dangling ends. When the entrepreneur, who's clearly burned out 3 years ago, but still insists on being on our board because this is their baby, and they're afraid of mission drift.
Been there, done that.
And were you that person?
No.
There's a face and a name right in your head, right? I have a few of those too. So we have to start bringing some discipline into our leadership structure and start to maybe have some difficult conversations with people who've been extremely valuable to the school and say, thank you very much for your contribution, but it's time for you to take another role in our school, in our community. Or for founders who are just tired to allow themselves to step back and everybody not panic. It's like, Jerry did everything. Now what are we gonna do? Right? Right. So that this it can be a really awkward time. It can be a very awkward time. When I was the head of the school in Austin, I got there in year 11. And I had 3 founders. And 2 of them were self-aware. And they were like, look, you don't need us anymore. Just call us if you need something. And they sort of exited graciously. The other guy hung on with every fiber of his being And it got to the point where it was almost pathetic, and nobody wanted to, hurt the guy or seem ungrateful for his contributions, but it just slowed us down. It made everything so much harder. And, every time something would come up that he thought was controversial or that he thought was, mission drifty, he'd hold us emotionally hostage for 2 meetings. And we'd still do the thing that we were going to do. And he would be mad and hurt. Anyway, you don't want to be that person. So, yeah.
The mission, does the mission change? You rework your mission statement? Because after your mission
Yeah.
is starting.
Yeah.
This is our goal, but after you've been around, your mission would shift. Do you rework your mission, and does that
Well,
move on?
if you mean mission as in terms of purpose and who we fundamentally are, by year 10, it probably is not going to change that much. How we want to do it and what we want to be, the visionary type stuff, could change. And that's often, though, where a founder can get in the way, because some people who are heavily invested in starting a school, they associate how we did stuff with why we did stuff, right? So if you say, for example, that we started with Shirley Grammar, let's say, is that still a thing? Okay. So we started with Shirley Grammar, and we get to year 8, and the teachers are like, we can't do Shirley Grammar anymore. And so we say, we're going to change our grammar program from Shirley Grammar to whatever else. Well, some of those founders will go, no, that's mission drift. Because Shirley Grammar was what we decided was classical. Anything else that you do is not going to be classical. And so that's part of the problem. They're so invested. I had a lady, this was the wife of a board member, but she was part of the couples that started the school, and she was heavily invested in furniture. Okay? I swear. And so she had been to this school in Dallas, and she had seen these beautiful desks, and they lifted up and they stayed up. You didn't have to prop them up, and they were sort of like angled, so it was like, and they were like this big. They were bigger than the kids, and it was like 7-year-olds with a drafting table for a desk, and so I get there and I'm like, no, we're getting desks, and these things were like $300 a piece. Somehow, it was maybe more. I don't remember. It was nuts. And she went berserk. That was mission drift, because those desks were perfectly designed for the classical education that was supposed to happen in 2nd grade at Regent School of Austin, and we might as well just be a public school now with our little desks and seats all connected together, right? You've had those conversations before, maybe. So that's what, those are the types of, and if you come in from the outside like I did, it all seems bonkers. You're like, what kind of a fun house did I end up in? It's like the crazy mirrors and everything, but everybody's invested. So the handover looks like a disciplined governing structure. It looks like term limits. It looks like rotations. It looks like intentionally designed positions on the board to promote stability and develop strong relationships within the school. So for instance, at this point, you might have had a board chair who had served, for 8 or 9 or 10 years, and that was just the role. Someone else becomes the board chair, but for the sake of stability, that person might be the chair for 3 years instead of 10 years at a time, so that the head of school doesn't have to constantly, re-engage with somebody new every year. So you're starting to think about, how do we do this in a way that's stable, that's disciplined, that's predictable, and that we're bringing potential board members into an environment that is regulated, and that they can very quickly figure out what's important to us, what the importance of the job, what our primary focus is, that sort of thing. And we're selecting board members instead of their quote unquote commitment to the school and to classical education, we're selecting them more to function. So we might be recruiting a board member because they're really good with numbers, who might not have read all of the books on classical education that all the rest of us read twice with notes, right? So we're starting to think more institutionally, organizationally, what does this board need? What kind of advice do we need? What kind of danger could we, or risks could we run that we need people on the board who understand those risks and can keep us out of trouble? We're thinking much more institutionally like that. And we have a process for selecting board members. We don't go just like, hey, I was like standing next to a guy at the basketball game and he seems really smart. Let's bring him on the board. And then it's like, next thing you know, he's on the board, So we're thinking more systematically, more process oriented. The board is also beginning to rely more on and defer more to the professional staff. Because we're moving ourselves out of present and past, we're thinking of more about the future. We can move out of present and past because we have professional people who know how to handle stuff. Right? They know what's going on in the school day by day. They know how to evaluate teachers. They know how to vet staff. They know how to do manage the books. They know how to, all the things that need to happen. So as a board, we are messing less with their stuff and relying on them more for information and reporting and just giving us a heads up. Hey, by the way, I'm probably going to fire somebody on Friday. Don't want you to be surprised when you hear about it. But we're not asking permission to fire this person on Friday. We're just letting you know that if you get a call on Saturday morning about this, it did happen. It is true. And we can talk about it at the board meeting next week if you want to. So it's just, the relationship is shifting. And then we're acknowledging a greater diversity of perspective within our school. Schools get started because people have a common understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. And without that common understanding and that common vision, that common sensibility, it doesn't happen. You can't start something if you got 5 people who want 5 different things and they're all trying to do their thing. But once we're started, we're going to attract more people into the school with different ideas about what the school really means to them and what it means to the community and why it's important. And how important is it that a school be classical or Lutheran? I mean, people are just going to bring different ideas. And we have to, at that sort of 10-ish, 15-year mark, we have to learn how to create a space for a diversity of opinion. Even if the diversity of opinion doesn't find its way up into the leadership structure, just recognizing that it's out there. I'll talk more about this tomorrow in terms of the characteristics that we are looking for in families as our school grows and as our school becomes more diverse and less homogeneous, and just at least philosophically. But a good example might be this. So at several of the schools with which I've worked, part of the admissions criteria in the early years was that parents demonstrate a really clear and enthusiastic understanding of what classical schooling is. So they had to read books, which, otherwise no one would have bought my book, by the way, because so many people were made to read it through the admissions process. Don't tell them I said that either. But they were, you had to read the stuff. And then when you came in, it was like a job interview. It was like we were interviewing the parents in the same way we would be interviewing the teachers, because we're trying to figure out how bought in they were. At 10 or 15 years, people are walking in, and if we say, read this book, they'll be like, why? No one else makes me read a book, right? And we start to move into a space where it's like, well, wait a minute, do we really need everybody to read a book in order for them to send their kids here? Are there other ways that we can actually bring them along through the experience of their child, and they'll be bought in to a classical education because the experience proves itself out? And so we don't need as much everybody to be so bought in philosophically on the front end as we used to. And now we can do parent education and development that says, let us tell you more about this thing. And it also becomes, potentially internal marketing too, because, there's more to read and there's more to talk about. And then it's cool. And they're like, I didn't know that. My second grader is going to blah, 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 whatever. Right? So there becomes shifting perspectives regarding what we need from people and how well prepared they come to us, or how much like us they are when they come to us versus where it was when we were first getting going.
But are
Yeah.
they influencing us? Is there danger of mission creep as more, quote, diverse parents?
Well, and that's where the board has to be diligent. The board has to be vigilant regarding the integrity of the mission and insist that the headmaster and the staff make decisions that are based on the mission. And
Right, it might be more difficult.
it is. It is. The more voices you hear, the more disciplined you have to be. Absolutely. If everybody agrees, that's easy. At the very beginning, at the beginning there wasn't any threat. So now protecting that mission and being able to articulate the reasons that we do things and the reasons we don't do things based on mission becomes really important in this phase. Absolutely.
That's what I was going to say. Is we will acknowledge the diversity, but be prepared to explain why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah, we actually have to explain more than we did before, because they just don't know what they're getting themselves into. So people came to us before and they knew by osmosis what this was supposed to be like. Now they come to us and they're more like consumers than they are crusaders for the cause. And so it's a different kind of relationship and a different kind of communication that has to exist in order for them to, really get integrated into our community.
Thinking of Hillsdale College's mission statement that hasn't changed for well over 100 years, and they read part of it at each portion.
Yeah.
And talk about having to hold the line on mission, and parents coming to the college and saying, why aren't you doing this and that?
Yeah.
Well, because it's not in our 100-and-some-year-old mission statement.
Yeah. First time a kid fails a semester of Latin in 7th grade, guess what you're going to hear? Time to get rid of Latin. Yeah, or whatever it is. That's challenging. So. But it's not unique to us. Every school that's doing a great job educating children is doing it based on some set of principles that someone in their community wishes they would change. That's just universal. And so if you're a Waldorf school, right, which would be the totally opposite end of the spectrum from us, or a Montessori school, somebody in your community wants you to compromise your Montessori principles for the sake of their convenience or something else. So it's just school. It's no big deal. We just smile and do stuff. Anything else? Any questions? All right, way to tough it out today, people. Good job.